of flesh and blood.
Welcome to Tell Me Your Story, New Paradigms for a New World. I'm Richard Dugan, your host. Wonderful to be here with you today because we're going to dive into a subject that I think we're all going to find interesting and fascinating. I've always found it fun to talk about some of the buzzwords that folks like to use over the course of time. The current one, and it's more than just a buzzword, I know that, quantum spirituality. Quantum is the one word I'm talking about. Science, Gnostic mysticism, that part I really love, and connecting with source consciousness. Even more, I love that because it's one of our prime pillars, if you will, asking you to spend time during the decade of perfect vision, the 2020s, and listening to that still small voice. We're going to talk about all of these elements here with Peter Canova. Peter, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a long time since we've had you on the program. We certainly have had your wife on the program quite a few times as well. Great to have you with us.
Good to be with you, Dan.
So let's talk about this aspect, and certainly I've sort of debated a little bit, but not in a hard way, over this whole issue of, let's see, there's physics, and then there's quantum physics, and of course somebody does explain it to me quite thoroughly. Tell me about the difference between spirituality and quantum spirituality.
Well, quantum spirituality is really kind of a merger of ancient mystical wisdom and modern quantum physics because they both cover similar subjects as their core focus, which is light, energy, and matter. And they both describe aspects of how those two fundamental things work in the nature of reality. So quantum spirituality really is pointing out the intersections of those different orientations. And the ultimate idea here is that you use this information to help you or help people have what I call extraordinary experiences with higher consciousness. That's the end goal.
Well, I do know that one of the aspects of all of, I mean, just the subtitle, the science, Gnostic mysticism, and connecting with source consciousness. People these days dealing with that first element of science, they're having a hard time because there are those who are real hardliners, and when science says ABC 1, 2, 3. There are those who are basically detractors. I don't believe that. I mean, the scientists that I talk to say XYZ 11, 12, 14. And we seem to challenge this whole thing. And I think that one of the things that I think many of these folks miss, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that science is not a laid in concrete type of thought and so forth. It's theories, and it's in a matter of speaking, sort of guessing, but then going about the process of trying to prove the theory. I don't argue, but I have conversations about dark matter. We can't see it, okay, but the math basically says that there is such a thing. So how do you get over that hurdle when you talk with people in reference to the science? Now, I know, too, that science and spirituality are sort of, they're starting to come together, aren't they?
Well, I think people have to recognize that there's science and there's science. Science has its own orthodoxy, just like religion has, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And scientific orthodoxy is what I call scientific materialism. And that has been the prevailing mode of scientists. Science is limited to what's observable and what's testable in a laboratory, which obviously has its limitations. It has things that hit questions that it's answered, but there's many questions that it can't answer. Now, you have what I call the new science. And the new science really is quantum physics, which is the study of the fundamental microscopic world that makes up our macroscopic world. And they are kind of the pioneers. So think of it like this. In our American history, we had the Western expansion, and there were the pioneers out there. Okay, they were making new discoveries, and it took quite a while for much of that information to filter back to the older areas back east. You know, the Bostons and the New Yorks and everything else.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of liken it this way, that many of the discoveries and theories that is on the cutting edge of quantum physics is slowly making its way back into the more orthodox, more established scientific world. But there's also, I think, very fundamental differences among scientists. I would say the majority of scientists, well, first of all, you have to understand scientists have to be very careful. A lot of them won't own up to what they believe, because if they do, they would be ridiculed and they would be, ostracized from scientific circles. So, for instance, you never mention God, or you never mention a supreme intelligence in scientific circles, even though much of science is now starting to indicate that an intelligence permeates everything that exists. But you won't find a lot of traditional scientists talking about that, because they would be scorned. So there is a movement, though, I think, among more progressive scientists that are kind of, like I say, out there pioneering, that they're understanding that instead of life being the great accident, which is a bunch of particles somehow colliding and forming more complex organisms that eventually lead up to like a human being and a human brain, there is no scientific basis for that. I mean, it's all garbage. It's just an excuse, because in reality, they don't really know the origin of life. A much more rational explanation of how life got here, rather than a bottom-up accident, is a top-down intention. Is intelligence, intelligent consciousness being the foundation of everything, and then working its way down through various stages of what we would call life, right down to maybe the lowest form, which is physical life, energy, spirit energy in material forms.
And just as a sidebar, what you've basically described, this is not a subject we're going to go down. This is not where we're headed with this conversation, but just as an example of how I've been thinking about this in terms of life and death, for example, of the mortal coil, shall we say. I've often thought, there's obviously this argument that's been going on in this country since 1973, and I've come to this conclusion and proposing this position. We need to define what death is before we can say when life begins. The assumption is that it begins blah, 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 blah. Well, yeah, but when is it no longer life? What is death? And I bring this up, for example, Lazarus in the New Testament, for example. Jesus raised him from the dead. And I sit there going, well, no, wait a minute. But then one of his followers says it is appointed to every man once to die, and then the judgment. So which is it? Then we have experiences across the board, Peter. People are having these near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, and so forth. This has to play a role in this conversation to an extent. Not the first part in terms of this whole Supreme Court business. I could personally,
putting the abortion issue aside,
yes.
I think that what we're really coming to understand is that we can't confine life to life in a physical body on Earth. Life really is something that happens over multiple dimensions. And there can be multiple dimensions of our own being in those multiple dimensions. So, I might be sitting here, but I really believe that there are other versions of me at higher levels of vibration that have worked their consciousness down. You often hear we're spirits having a human experience, not humans having a spiritual experience. Well, I think there's a lot of truth in that, because essentially we are kind of an experiment of spirit down here. When you really think about it, spirit is energy, and energy vibrates at a very different level. So, inquisitive spirits managed to find a way to work themselves into material forms, but we're really kind of like visitors in these material bodies. These aren't our true homes. And yes, they do get abandoned, and yes, they do decay, and they do die eventually. But that means that, you know, we leave that experience, and, you know, we're moving on to other experiences. So life is really a continuation; it never ends. It's a continual process, because the source that we all originate from is eternal. And, you know, speaking about that, one thing that, you know, the Gnostics made a real distinction between you know, what the Judeo-Christian tradition tells us, which is that we are creations of some supreme being. Well, a creation is something separate from yourself. Okay, so for instance, Geppetto made Pinocchio. Pinocchio is a puppet; it's not Geppetto. But the Gnostics said, no, that ain't the way it works. We're actually projections or emanations of the force that was behind everything, of that one intelligence. So think of it in a way, we're like, if the force is like the main grid, we're like the relay stations, okay? So we participate in that whole stream of consciousness. We're part of that stream of consciousness that projected everything into reality. So in truth, there's no separation between us and this supreme force. The only thing is that we're diluted versions, so we don't really remember. That limitation of consciousness really has everything to do with having individual experience. Because if we didn't have limitations and we were always present in the supreme consciousness, we wouldn't be individuals. We'd just be reabsorbed back into the whole. So, you know, this is kind of, or at least the way I have experienced and studied the way it all works.
Peter Canova is my guest, and petercanova.com is the website. That's PeterCanova.com. Peter Canova. We will be linked to that website so that you folks can find out more as we continue here on Tell Me Your Story. I'm Richard Dugan, your host, and I want to continue on this path, because one of the things that I find interesting. Now, it was a few years ago that I sort of came to this conclusion, and I would love your input on this. And that is the concepts that are laid out in the founding documents of this country specifically are in a manner of speaking in direct opposition, not only to what you've said, but in direct opposition to the alleged founding philosophy, the Judeo-Christian philosophy that many people like to say this country was founded on. And the First Amendment, for example, of talking about individual rights and freedoms, well, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But it's like, wait a minute, I don't read anywhere in the texts of the Old or New Testament where anybody has any individual rights. You either follow God or you go to hell and spend your eternity with all the rest who are there. And that there is no individuality in that sense. It's not saying that we aren't individuals, but that we are part of a community. And even on the spiritual level, as you've alluded to, can you, and I've kind of put it this way, life, liberty, and so forth, they're not wrong and they're not bad, but from I'm even going to go take it to the title of your book, Quantum Spirituality. From the quantum spirituality perspective, they're irrelevant. They're just irrelevant. Again, there's no judgment. It's just that because we're all connected.
I'm not exactly sure what you're getting at, but I think I am. So let me take a step.
Please.
Let me take a stab at it. You know, just because the reality is that everything is a whole, okay, doesn't mean under certain conditions that things like individuality, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and so forth, that there's nothing wrong with that, and it's not mutually exclusive to being part of a whole. Because I think that the whole idea of individuality were spirits exploring individual existence apart from a kind of like hive mind. And that is really, in my mind, an extension of this one force trying to experience itself in all manners of creation. So, like we said, there's different dimensions of existence. We could be experiencing things in a plane that's very near to us, but they don't have physical bodies per se. They have energetic bodies.
Mm-hmm.
And you could be, in other dimensions where it has, even different laws of reality. But it's all an exploration by spirit to understand something outside of itself. And after all, if the supreme force, and we can call it, you can call it God,
Mm-hmm.
the supreme force, anything you want, it's all the same thing. The label doesn't matter. So I can use the word God. It really doesn't matter. But if God had not wanted to experience something outside itself, because eternity can be an awfully lonely thing. Eternity is static. Eternity is like existing, but it's not necessarily experiencing. So obviously, there seemed to be a desire or an impetus of this supreme force, not just to exist and be, I am, therefore I am, but to experience.
Mm-hmm.
So you could really say that when we come down here and we're, going through various levels of individual experience, and we're guaranteed the right to do that without being forced into a collective kind of, lock and step mentality, that's a very noble thing. And it is spiritual. Okay. Now you can carry it to extremes. Everything can be carried to extremes. Extreme individuality can lead to selfishness and even evil, because you get so far away from the understanding of being part of the whole that you can do damage to yourself and others. So there's always extremes. Mm-hmm. But if we're talking about staying within, the field of reason, it's really like kind of a noble effort, because I always say the conclusion I came to is that our purpose is to be the fingers of God touching the face of this earth. And we spiritualize the material and bring the experience of the material back to spirit. And one day, I think that veil that separates spirit and energy very well will merge. And that's, I think, what the kingdom of heaven is that they talked about in the Bible. It's when heaven comes down to earth and earth is raised up to heaven. And I do believe there was a time in our spiritual history where we were able to move in and out of bodies freely. We were able to project ourselves into material objects, but then go back to spirit. We lost that ability because eventually we decided to define reality as within the boundaries of our skin. So, but I do believe that our whole task here is remembrance. And we don't learn, we really remember, because everything we need to know, we already really know at some level, but we need to remember. And that's called awakening. And when we do that, this veil between the spiritual and material, it starts to thin out.
Yeah. My eldest sister and my father are in spirit, as they say these days. In the past 13 months, lost those two of the family. I'm 63, almost 63. And I have been thinking about that for many years, that I knew that one day I'd get the call. And I got the call twice, and our family was a family of 8. So assuming, don't want to really assume, but assuming that I am able to outlive everybody, I'm going to get 7 phone calls in my lifetime about the fact that they've transitioned, or to quote Bernie Siegel, who we've had on this program. We were talking about his late wife, and I made the comment about her transitioning, and he stopped me mid-sentence and said, "No, she didn't transition. She died. My wife died," and so in deference and respect to Bernie Siegel, yes, my sister and my father have died. But one of the things that has been so astounding to me is when my sister passed in 2022, I could hear her telling me, "Hey, Richard, it's okay. Everything's okay." But with my father, it's more an impression. And it's one of the perspectives that I take when talking about death. And that is, well, first of all, my father had very poor sight, had very poor hearing, and stability problems. So my mother said, she told him before he lost consciousness, he says, as soon as you get to the other side, you're going to be able to see perfectly. You're going to be able to hear. And then I added to that conversation, and you won't, and you can walk without falling down, which she kind of got a chuckle out of. But now they're everywhere. That at one point they were in Phoenix in their respective skin suits, as it were. Now they're everywhere. And it was something you said also about, everything is energy. And it's just, what is the right word, transformed? Because that's kind of what happens. I mean, they even cremated both of them. And so that energy of the body was transformed into something else. Uh, Talk to us a little bit about, again, yes, we are spiritual beings having a human experience. And I think that's probably the more appropriate way to put it. But talk to us a little bit about this aspect of moving from, shall we say, one world into the other. It's sort of what you were talking about before. And the one word that came to my mind was bilocation, where we can travel without a locomotion. We just, hey, I want to be here. Oh, okay, now I want to be over here. Can you share with us your perspective from quantum spirituality?
Well, yeah, let's talk about it from the quantum side first. And, everything is light energy. What science has found is that at the most fundamental levels of reality, particles don't exist. The only thing that exists is an energy field, light wave energy. Under certain conditions, particles can collapse from that, and human consciousness has something to do with that, as some famous experiments have showed. But at the very fundamental level, it's light energy. Now, if you look at Einstein's E equals mc squared, what that very simply says is that matter comes from energy. Matter and energy are interchangeable. So that's the basis of nuclear energy, for instance. Nuclear energy takes particles and literally splits them down to the point where they become energy again. And it's that release of energy that causes the nuclear force. So it's not really different from the human body. When somebody dies or passes on, the human body releases that energy, and it goes back into the energy field, if you will. So there's a scientific way to look at death, as well as a spiritual way to look at death. And the Gnostics essentially said that, Gnostics described parallel universes very early, 2,000 years before quantum physics did. And in the Gnostic conception of parallel universes aren't really defined so much by spaces. They're not like places, in effect, but what they are is they are frequencies of vibration. So that people tend to, go back to those levels which have a common vibration to them, have a common vibration to their consciousness. Okay, those levels of vibration call to the particular vibration of our consciousness, and of course, consciousness can change. We can increase that frequency. We can also decrease that frequency, but that's how you kind of progress up through the layers of dimension, of the layers of being. I guess in spiritual terms, that's how you sort of ascend to heaven. Let's say, is by increasing that spiritual frequency or level of conscious vibration. So these things are all related, and the passing of a physical body can be described in both spiritual and quantum terms.
We're talking with Peter Canova. PeterCanova.com's the website, and you're listening to Tell Me Your Story. I'm Richard Dugan, your host, and quantum spirituality, fascinating work and conversation as well. Science, Gnostic mysticism, and connecting with source consciousness. I want to talk about the latter two, but before we do that, I want to ask you, you used the word awakening. So describe for us about your own awakening. When did that happen?
Well, I was in my 20s, long ago and far away, and Star Wars. And I discovered that I was a very accurate medical intuitive. All somebody had to do was give me somebody's name, age, and address, and I could very accurately diagnose what their issues were, whether it was physical or mental. And when that happened, it kind of unleashed a whole series of experiences that I had with clairaudience, clairvoyance, premonitions, remote viewing. I went through all these things, and the importance of going through these things was that I realized that all this stuff is real. I mean, you can hear this from people, right? you can hear about these things, but unless you've experienced it, there's just really no way that you can say, yeah, okay, I'm not sure I really believe that. But, the whole purpose of me writing this book, it's the result of like more than 40 years worth of research, because when these experiences happened to me, being a Capricorn, it wasn't enough for me just to have the experiences. I wanted to understand the nuts and bolts behind it. So then I embarked on this whole, research program that led me to quantum physics.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized that what was really behind this was me connecting with an intelligent force that's out there. It's like a radio broadcast. It's out there 24/7. The trick is you got to attune to get the right frequency, okay? Mm-hmm. Because if you don't get the frequency, you don't hear the channel. So I'm nothing special. We can all get there. We all get there through different paths. But I wrote this book in order to be kind of like a roadmap for people. And on a roadmap, you need coordinates. You need an X and Y axis, or you need latitude and longitude, right? So my latitude and longitude that I use is quantum physics and ancient spiritual wisdom. And I try to essentially break down the whole process of reality and the operation of how this force permeates and works throughout creation to really help people on their spiritual journey. Like I said, it's a roadmap. I can't show you the way, but I can give you some signposts that you can follow yourself if you have the desire to do so. You got to put the work in yourself. No one else can do that. But this is quantum spirituality is a really powerful tool of knowledge to help you get beyond mere faith in things, to help you get beyond beliefs, which can be wrong. Faith and beliefs can be wrong. There's nothing that says that faith and belief is correct. There's been a lot of instances where people put their faith and their beliefs in completely wrong things, and the outcome is not so great. But, when you get knowledge that comes from a personal experience, then you own it. And once you do that, you're on the road to revelation. Revelation is when you become your own prophet and you have direct experiences with this consciousness, so that you no longer have to take anybody else on faith. You can weigh everything you see, hear, and are told by your own inner experience. And that is more like revelation. That's when you become, a reliable source to guide yourself. And that's what I'm trying to help people do by all this research that I put into the book.
He also has a podcast, folks, called Quantum Spirituality. It's on Dream Vision 7 Radio Network. How many languages do you speak?
Well, I speak 2 pretty well, and then there's a couple more that I understand but don't speak as well.
Okay. I've often thought about that in terms of being bilingual, trilingual, etc. And at one point, I had 2 languages, English and computer, back when we were using DOS. That going back a few years, isn't it?
Good old DOS.
Yeah, I still remember constructing a line of code in DOS on my screen, and I was amazed on 2 levels. Number one was I was amazed when I looked at it going, wow, I wrote that. And then the other amazement was, and it works. It did what I wanted it to do. But if the syntax isn't correct, then nothing happens. And I sometimes wonder, being that you are multilingual and so forth in different areas, it's one of the questions that comes up for me quite often, and I want to get into that in just a moment as we continue here on Tell Me Your Story. I'm Richard Dugan, your host, and we're talking with Peter Canova about his book, Quantum Spirituality. You have a part here where it talks about Gnosticism, Gnostic mysticism. Now, one of the questions I want to ask you in terms of what I refer to as the ancient wisdom teachings, and this could include pretty much anything going back hundreds or thousands of years. I would even put into that context the Akashic records, which have not been put in print. Okay, they're not in that context as far as I know. But what about this aspect of trying to understand quantum spirituality or spirituality in general, or the rules or laws of the universe from other languages. Case in point, Hebrew. I know enough about the alphabet, 22 characters. Each one has its own legend, kind of like when you look at a map and you look down in the corner there, and all of the symbols that are on this map are defined for you. So each one of these letters has a numerical ranking, it has a tone, it has like its own story. Then you start putting those letters together into words, into sentences, into paragraphs, chapters, book. But when you translate it into another language, in a manner of speaking, that all goes away. Can you talk to us about the aspect that maybe you even ran into this as you were putting this book together and other books that you've written, including your trilogy? How much is lost in translation?
Well, yeah, I mean, certainly some things are lost in translation. For instance, one of the central characters in the Gnostic creation story is called Sophia. And a lot of people don't recognize that Sophia is mentioned all throughout the Bible. The reason why we don't recognize it is because we get the English translation of Sophia, which is wisdom. So if you look, for instance, in the book of Proverbs, wisdom is spoken of quite frequently. It's a female. First of all, it's female. Okay. Mm-hmm. It's one of the things that you may lose in translation, in a language like English that doesn't make gender distinctions. Okay. But Greek does, that Sophia was a female. And she says in the Bible, I was there from the beginning. I was there with God from the beginning. What Sophia really is an aspect of the divine that is in operation in our world here. And in the Gnostic myth, Sophia played quite an interesting role in the Gnostic creation story, which is a whole another thing. I'm not really sure if we have time to get into that, but it's fascinating. And that story is where you see the direct parallels with quantum physics in predicting the Big Bang, the God particle, and parallel universes. But yeah, certainly you do lose something in the translation. But I think what you probably lose more of is context, cultural context. Mm-hmm. So for instance, if you read the Gnostic Gospels, if you don't have a good amount of scholarship and cultural context behind you, you really won't understand what's being said. It'll sound like a lot of gibberish to the average person. It takes a lot of study. And it takes a lot of cross-referencing to really understand and decipher what is being said in these ancient texts. But at the end of the day, what you do see is that there was a common set of spiritual teachings in the ancient world. And over time, they got a little confused and diluted because of acculturation, different cultures. But really, if you look at the Hindu, the Zoroastrian, the Greco-Roman, the Greco-Roman Hellenistic philosophy, the Jewish Kabbalah, these things were all pretty much saying the same thing. And what's cool about the Gnostics, and the reason why I zeroed in on them, is that having sort of being mostly in Alexandria, Egypt, which was the intellectual melting pot of the time, dwarfing Athens and Rome in that regard.
Yeah.
The Gnostics really combined all these different streams. They really synthesized the different spiritual traditions and kind of wove them back together after they had unwoven over the centuries. And the Gnostic masters, the information that they brought back from the other side was just so mind-blowing and so precise and so scientific that even somebody like the famous Carl Jung, the psychologist, when he first discovered the Gnostic text, he basically said, these people already preempted me by 2,000 years.
Yeah. This kind of conversation has always been fascinating to me because I have maybe one or two versions of the Gita. I have multiple versions, of course, of the Bible. I'm working on trying to acquire a copy of the Quran, but also wanting to understand it. And one of the conversations I had with a rabbi once, and we were talking about one of the Jewish laws in the Old Testament. And to your point, his question to me was, do you know the context in which this law was written or created or put down? I said, I have no clue. I have no clue as to any one of the 613 laws, the context therein. And so he would explain it to me. And I said, you know what? That makes perfect sense. But this is where I run into a problem with some of these biblical scholars. For example, I was watching this one video. One guy was talking about the Ten Commandments, and specifically the one about thou shalt not kill. And he says, actually, in the original language, that is the word murder. And I'm sitting here going, oh, wait a minute. This book's been around for several thousand years. In print for many hundreds of years since the Gutenberg Bible, and you're telling me that nobody had the foresight, nobody had the gumption, nobody had the wherewithal to correct that, and yet it still says in my Old Testament, "Thou shalt not kill." And that's the reason that I bring up this subject of what's lost in translation. It's like, if that's what it means, then why doesn't it say that? Along the same lines of in the New Testament about death and dying, between Jesus raising Lazarus from quote unquote the dead versus Paul saying it is appointed to a man every man wants to die.
Yeah, I
I
think.
read a. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I think, to your point, I think the biggest thing that's lost in translation isn't really language. It's really knowledge, because I always say that prophets speak the heart of God, their followers start religions, because the prophet has the insight. The prophet has the direct insight, which the followers don't. So when the prophet essentially passes on, if he's even understood by his followers, the followers have their own foibles, they have their own agendas, and we end up getting religion. So what you read in the Bible or the Quran or any of these sacred texts, you have to take with a grain of salt, because it's the divine word, or let's say it's the knowledge of the supreme intelligence, but it's filtered through imperfect human mediums. So that, if you look at the three Abrahamic religions, for instance, okay, the Sufis, the Kabbalists, and the Gnostics are closer to each other than they're closer to their respective religions. Sufism is the mystical tradition of Islam. Gnosticism was the mystical tradition of Christianity, and the Kabbalah was the mystical tradition of Judaism. Now, the Christians did an amazing job of eradicating the Gnostics and setting us back thousands of years in knowledge. Sufism and the Kabbalah still exist, but these three mystical traditions, if you look at what they're saying, they have more in common with one another than the religious traditions that they're supposed to be part of. And what that really indicates is just how far religions will stray. So in the case of Christianity, it wasn't called Christianity to begin with. It was called the Way. Now, that should tell you something right there. The Way was a set of mystical teachings to open up higher consciousness. It wasn't a religion. The Way, think of that word for a second and the implication of that word. So it's very clear from both passages in the Bible and from the writings of the early church fathers that Jesus had two teachings. One was the inner mystical teaching that he gave to the so-called elect, meaning those who could understand it. And the other was the public teaching for the masses. So that was the parables, and that was largely the material that we have in the Bible. But in the Bible itself, it says that Jesus spoke unto the masses in parables, but unto the disciples, he gave the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Origen and Clement, the two bishops of early Alexandria, affirmed that Jesus had a secret mystical teaching, but that it wasn't given out to the masses because they didn't believe the masses could really understand it. So Gnosticism embodied this secret inner mystical teaching, which is why I really sort of rely on the recovered Gnostic text a little bit more than what I would in the Bible, because I think it speaks to a truer form of spiritual revelation.
I appreciate your saying that, because the longer I live and the more I learn, the more I'm questioning, and I'm of the philosophy that was actually shared with me when I was 21, a long time ago. And again, another one of those in a galaxy far, far away. This was the phrase: It is better to begin in doubt and end in certainty than to begin in certainty and end in doubt. And I've really tried to live by that. And I had one guest, we were chatting away, and he challenged me very kindly on one of my points, and I listened intently, and yeah, okay. Well, there goes another one of my huts up in flames, and I'm willing to burn them all to the ground to start over again if I have to. Because my beliefs of yesterday are not my beliefs of today, are not my beliefs of tomorrow, because I'm still alive and I'm learning and growing, just like you are. And that's why you're sharing with us the Quantum Spirituality, the book, Quantum Spirituality, Science, Gnostic Mysticism, and the connecting with source consciousness as we continue here on Tell Me Your Story. I'm Richard Dugan, your host, and Peter Canova.
I just wanted to address
Please.
the point you just made, because I think it's very important.
Yes.
What the spirit of what you just said is the difference between a spiritual journey and religion. Okay. So religion, basically, if you think of you're a traveler, right? And as you travel along the way, you encounter these way stations. So religion is the boxes in these way stations. It says, okay, if you come in here, we'll give you the truth, but you got to stay within this box because that's the truth. Mm-hmm. Okay, so spirituality, though, more like what you said, is an open-ended exploration. You take what truth you have there and you continue on the journey, and it might be superseded by a higher revelation or a higher truth. That's the difference between spirit and religion, and I think you just summed it up very nicely in terms of your approach and attitude.
Well, I think it's arrogance on my part specifically, and again, what I make reference to and share as far as my observations and opinions, those are mine. I don't put them on anybody else. That's not my intent. Everybody's got to find their own way. You want to take a little piece of this and that of what I've said? Wonderful. I hope it works for you. But today it works for me. I don't know if it'll work tomorrow. I have no idea because I don't know what's coming next.
I always say when I give public talks, I often start off by telling the audience, don't believe a damn thing I'm going to tell you. And they all sit there scratching their heads like, what did I come here for?
Exactly.
But I say, look, that doesn't mean I don't want you to listen to me. It doesn't mean I don't want you to consider what I'm saying. What I want you to do is take this information provisionally, because basically what I want you to do is use the information in quantum spirituality, which incidentally, it's like a real tour de force of creation. Not only gets into quantum physics and ancient spirituality, but it gets into Jungian psychology and archetypes and, just really explaining how the whole world operates. But you just take this as a signpost on your journey to guide you, okay, but you'll figure out your own truth along the way, and that's where I'm hoping people land after looking at the material that I've done. I hope they test this out in light of their own spiritual practice, and I also do talk a little bit about meditation and about different ways that meditation can be enhanced. And because ultimately it comes down to people having to experiment and work with these things and practice with these things. Yeah. It's not good enough just to take it as an intellectual exercise. You have to start to internalize it.
Yeah. Peter Canova is my guest. PeterCanova.com is the website. The book is called Quantum Spirituality. Once again, science, Gnostic mysticism, and connecting with the source consciousness here on Tell Me Your Story. I'm Richard Dugan, your host, and I want to dive in for this last portion of our program to that aspect. As I mentioned earlier, one of the things that we talk about, I mean, I make reference usually at the beginning of the program, but I like to dive right in this one. I talk about, when we're heard and how you can listen to us and all of these things. And then, if you'd like to support the work we're doing, but then I go to this place, and it is, we ask that you participate in what I have termed the decade of perfect vision, the 2020s, where we ask you to go within and listen to that still small voice. So rather than me going in any further, is that basically what you're referring to in maybe in a minor way from my perspective, and you can elucidate the connecting with source consciousness, that going within?
Yeah, absolutely. Because when you go within, remember, as I said, we're projections of this one force. So everything is already within us. It's only our limited thinking, our limited views of things that prevent us from understanding that. And the way that we overcome that is by going within and getting in touch with that power that is within us. It's like kind of like, the sleeper must awaken in Dune. And essentially that is really our task. We have to awaken the sleeper within. And when we do that, it has tremendous effects, beneficial effects on our life. I mean, I can't tell you how many times this awareness or consciousness has helped me. I mean, I'm an international businessman, and here I take off and I write this best-selling series of books, the First Souls Trilogy, and Pope Annalisa, which they won 25 awards. I mean, I almost feel like somebody else wrote them. It was like a stream of consciousness coming through me. And in fact, they did an article in Own Times Magazine about all the geopolitical predictions that came true in the book, because much of this information was channeled. This information has saved my life on occasions. And I was a Chicken Soup for the Soul author, and I wrote a chapter in there about how this saved my life in Africa with a premonition where I very likely might have been killed. There's so many ways that this can be beneficial to your life. And what you find is that when you get in touch with this power, the benefits just start to bleed in. And, sometimes you have to look back in hindsight to recognize and say, oh, how did that happen? So, there's a real payoff there. And I really encourage people, like you said, to take that time. I know we're all busy. I know we all have problems. But that's the whole point of why you should do this, is to help solve your problems, be a better problem solver.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. And I love that. I mean, I know on the one hand that it's really great, like what I see behind you, all of those books and the hundreds, if not thousands of books that I happen to have, maybe not on bookshelves. I have several containers out in a shed, and they're secured enough to where they're not damaged by the weather. But I've got these thousands of books on so many different spiritual concepts and philosophies and constructs and on and on and on. But at the same time, I also recognize that if I got rid of them all, I wouldn't be losing anything, because that isn't where I should be, in a manner of speaking, getting the guidance and the information. I already have it all if I just spend that time going within.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Although I do think that books and knowledge play an important role, because first of all, they can be inspirational.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the things that people like myself are really trying to do is inspire people to understand that there is something more out there. There are hidden dimensions of existence that we can get in contact with to the betterment of our lives. So there's the inspirational factor. And then I also think that, what I found is when I read the certain books, all of a sudden something clicks that was at the back of my mind, but what they're saying in the book brings it to the forefront. And it's like, aha, there's a connection there. Some of the dot just got connected from my subconscious to my conscious mind. So yeah, there certainly is a role though that books can play, but ultimately, yes, I do agree with you. The most important thing is what's inside you.
Yeah. And of course, growing up, being born and raised Catholic, that's not what I was taught. You go to the priest and he's going to have the answers. I will say that I drew to me some very honest priests, a Monsignor in the Byzantine Rite of the Catholic Church, when he would come over around the spring to bless the house, which was one of the rituals. I asked him, I said, why is it with what we have of the historical record of crucifixion, why is it that Jesus is not depicted naked on the cross? Because that was the final indignity. He was stripped naked. And he was honest and upfront with him. He says, because the church does not want to upset the sensibilities of the people. And I thought, well, how considerate. But doesn't it also say, ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free? But I think it goes back to something you said earlier from that passage where it says, "Ye shall know the truth." I think I think it has more to do with ye shall know the truth about you, who you are, not what's in a book or what somebody else said or what have you, but who and what you are. Your thoughts before we wrap up?
Well, yeah, and I think the original message of Christianity and the original Jesus wasn't so much putting Jesus up on a pedestal and saying he's God and we need to bow down and worship him. Jesus was foremost a teacher and a prophet and a revealer. And yes, he was the Son of God, but I think the original Jesus would tell you, but I'm not the only one. We are all sons and daughters of God. Now, he may have read a few chapters ahead, and because of his level of consciousness, he may certainly have enjoyed something, how can I say, he may have enjoyed abilities or things that would appear, superhuman or exceptional to us. But I think that Jesus would not say, I'm God and the only way through God is me. That to me is really, again, the trappings of religion and what religion wrote on top of the original mystical tradition. Yeah. So I always try and go back to the sources as much as I can. And, it's when you do, I think you get a little bit closer to the truth of things. And the fact of the matter, again, is that, we are all sons and daughters of God, and we all have the great potentialities within us. But remember, it's up to us to do the work. You don't just sit there, sitting in your chair and all of a sudden expect fireworks to go off and you're lifted up and, levitated, up towards heaven. It just doesn't happen that way. You've got to put in the work yourself, and the miracles will come. And what I mean by miracles is it's a change in patterns that you think are set patterns. Mm-hmm. Things that you think are impossible all of a sudden start to become possible. Things that don't seem likely start to happen. So they do happen. Again, it's not like this Hollywood miracles with fireworks going off and bells and whistles. It's changes, little starts off as little changes in the patterns that you may want to see changed, or you didn't believe it was possible to change. They start to happen.
Yeah. Well, Peter, I want to thank you so much for giving us so much time here on the program. And of course, we had you on some time ago when Pope Annalisa came out. Again, another fascinating interview, a conversation that we had. And I do want to have you back to continue this conversation. Have you got another book in the works, or is this right now quantum spirituality? This is your main focus?
Yeah, it's my main focus. I have a lot of projects right now. I had to get very much involved with my business again. And so I've got about 3 things going. We're trying to get Pope Annalisa into a TV series right now. And I have a partner who was an ex-HBO executive, and we're out in the street now pushing that. And then, of course, I have to promote my book like I'm doing on your show here to make people aware of that. So I think for the time being, that's probably it. I need to take a little bit of a rest here.
Well, I'll tell you what, I do have 3 final questions that I ask my guests. We're in our 15th year. We're in the midst of our 15th year, and I'll ask those questions. But first, I want to thank you for listening to and watching Tell Me Your Story, New Paradigms for a New World, where we are giving you choices and knowledge of those choices to help make your dreams come true. We are here on Sundays at 7 a.m. and 7 p.m., Monday mornings at 1 a.m., and Wednesdays at 9 a.m. for a special edition of Tell Me Your Story. We stream live at those times at richarddugan.com. Our podcasts are on SoundCloud, iTunes, TuneIn Radio, Spotify, Stitcher, Player FM, Blueberry, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, and many other locations. We're also on YouTube, where you can watch these interviews. We hope you'll click notification so that when I put up a new conversation, you'll know it's there and you'll be able to listen to it, like this one here with Peter Canova. And hey, if you can support us financially, that would be terrific. We have a PayPal account. It's there for your security as well as ours. And also spend that time here in the decade of perfect vision, the 2020s, going within and listening to that still small voice. And with all of that, let me start with, who is Peter Canova?
Well, like I say, I'm just a guy that had certain experiences that I kind of want to share with the world, not because I'm so interesting, but because I think they can inspire people and help them to show that there's a pattern or a path that they can follow that will be very rewarding for them at the end.
What is your life's purpose?
Pretty much what I just told you. I mean, if they really want the same. I mean, I hope to be an inspiration, or at least provide inspirational information to people so that they understand. And, ultimately, Richard, what it's really about is fear is the greatest impediment to human existence.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that alleviating fear by understanding the way that the universe operates, by understanding the force that permeates all creation, is a very comforting thing. And it's not faith. I'm talking about really getting to the point where you actually experience the reality of this force in operation. And I think everybody can achieve that. And that's what I hope my work can help people do.
And finally, what was your best day?
Probably the day that I found out that I was a medical intuitive and I could actually see what was going on and help people. I went home that night and I started thinking, how is this possible? And I said, to myself, the only way that this can be possible is we have to all be part of one whole. We have to be like all connected in a matrix, like a hologram, where each part contains the image of the whole. And I shut my eyes and I fell asleep with my clothes on, kind of sitting up in my bed. And it was the greatest feeling of peace I think I've ever experienced. I felt this unity. I felt this light wash over me with that realization. And it was probably the most relaxed I've ever been, because I do tend to be hyper. And this is probably the most relaxed I've ever been.
Well, I'm glad that we were able to be part of that relaxation. And we thank you for joining us here on the program.
Good to be here.
And I thank you for listening to and watching Tell Me Your Story, New Paradigms for a New World. And until our next broadcast, podcast, videocast, love to Lal, Jeanette, I'm listening, and Dad, be happy.